June 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy. German panzer crews sat in their superior tanks. Better armor, better guns, better engineering. On paper, they should have dominated every engagement, but they kept losing, again and again and again. The German tankers couldn't understand it. Their Panthers and Tigers were technologically superior. Their crews were experienced. Their tactics were proven. So why were they being outmaneuvered by inferior American Sherman tanks? The answer was invisible. It couldn't be seen through a periscope or measured in millimeters of armor. It was transmitted through the air at the speed of light. The answer was radio. This is the story of the technological advantage that German troops never saw coming. The story of how American communications technology turned the tide of armored warfare. Oberfeldwebel Kurt Schneider was a tank commander in the 2nd Panzer Division. He had fought in France in 1940, in Russia in 1941 and 1942, and now he found himself back in France, facing the Allied invasion. His tank was a Panther Ausf A, one of Germany's finest armored vehicles. 75mm high-velocity gun, sloped armor, powerful engine. On paper, it was superior to anything the Americans had. Schneider had seen the American Sherman tanks. He had examined knocked-out examples. He had read the intelligence reports. Tinned coffins, the reports called them. Under-armored, under-gunned, mechanically simple, mass-produced quantity over German quality. Pause. The intelligence reports were both right and catastrophically wrong. July 8, 1944, near Caen. Schneider's platoon of 4 Panthers engaged an American tank company near a small village. The Germans had superior position on a ridge. They had better range. They had better guns. They should have won easily. The first shots rang out. Schneider's gunner hit an American Sherman at 1,200 meters. The Sherman brewed up, black smoke pouring from the hatches. But then, something strange happened. The other American tanks didn't scatter. They didn't retreat in panic. Instead, they moved with coordinated precision, some laying smoke, others flanking, others suppressing with fire. Within minutes, Schneider's platoon was surrounded. 2 of his Panthers were burning. He was forced to abandon his tank and retreat on foot. Later, hiding in a farmhouse, Schneider tried to understand what had happened. The Americans hadn't fought better. Their tanks weren't superior. But somehow, they had moved like a single organism, like they could read each other's minds. How did they coordinate so quickly? He asked his surviving crew. We barely had time to fire before they were flanking us. His radio operator, a veteran of the Eastern Front, had a theory. Herr Oberfeldwebel, I think every one of their tanks has a radio. Schneider laughed. That's impossible. Radio equipment is too expensive, too complex. Only command tanks have radios. But his radio operator wasn't joking. To understand why the Germans were shocked by American radio capabilities, we need to understand the German approach to tank communications. In the Wehrmacht, radio was considered a specialized, expensive technology. German tanks typically had radios only in command vehicles, usually 1 radio per platoon of 4 or 5 tanks. The standard German practice was this. The platoon commander's tank had a radio. The other tanks received orders through hand signals, flag signals, or if they were lucky, a short-range intercom system. John sense? This system worked well enough in the early war years when German forces were advancing rapidly against disorganized opposition. But it had critical weaknesses. Hauptmann Werner Hoffmann was a signals officer in the Panzer Lehr Division. Before the war, he had been an electrical engineer. He understood radio technology intimately, and he understood Germany's problem. In 1943, Hoffmann wrote a report that was largely ignored by High Command. In it, he outlined the communications disadvantage German armored units faced. Our tanks fight blind and deaf. Only the command vehicle can receive orders or report enemy positions. If the command tank is destroyed, the entire platoon becomes disorganized. Individual tanks cannot call for support, cannot report targets, cannot coordinate with infantry. We are fighting a modern war with communication methods from 1918. The report was filed and forgotten. Radio equipment was expensive. Germany was already struggling with production shortages. Why waste resources putting radios in every tank when only the commander needed one? This decision would cost them dearly. While Germany rationed radios to command vehicles only, America took a radically different approach. Every single Sherman tank, from the basic M4 to the upgraded M4A3, came equipped with not one, but two radio systems as standard equipment. The SCR-508 radio for long-range communication between tanks and command units. The SCR-528 intercom system for communication between crew members inside the tank. This wasn't a luxury. It wasn't an upgrade for elite units. It was standard. Every Sherman that rolled off the production line in Detroit, Chicago, or Los Angeles had full radio capability built in. The Germans didn't believe it was possible. Lieutenant Robert Hayes was a Sherman tank commander in the 2nd Armored Division. Before the war, he had worked as a radio technician in Philadelphia. When he was assigned to tanks, he was astonished by the communications equipment. "I had better radio equipment in my tank than some police departments had in their entire fleet," Hayes later recalled. "We could talk to every tank in our platoon simultaneously. We could switch frequencies to talk to infantry, artillery, air support. We could communicate clearly at ranges up to 15 miles under good conditions." The SCR-508 was a marvel of American engineering. Frequency-modulated transmission, crystal-controlled channels, push-to-talk simplicity. It was designed to be operated by regular soldiers, not communication specialists. Baker 2-3. This is Baker 2-1. Enemy armor spotted at grid reference. Baker 2-1. This is Baker 2-3. I have visual. Moving to flank. All Baker units. This is Baker 6. Artillery support inbound. Mark your positions with smoke. This kind of coordination was simply impossible for German units, where only one tank in 5 could communicate. September 1944. Near the town of Ericourt in eastern France. This battle would demonstrate the devastating effectiveness of American radio superiority. The German 5th Panzer Army launched a counterattack against American positions. On paper, it should have been a German victory. They had over 200 tanks, including Panthers and Mark IVs. The Americans had approximately 150 Shermans, but the Americans had something more valuable than numbers or armor thickness. They had information. Captain James Leach commanded a company of Shermans from the 4th Armored Division. As German tanks advanced through the morning fog, American reconnaissance reported their movements via radio. Every Sherman commander heard the reports simultaneously. Enemy armor, approximately 40 tanks, advancing from the northeast. Additional enemy contacts, 20-plus tanks, moving south along the tree line. Enemy concentration, forming at the road junction. Leach didn't need to relay orders to individual tanks. Every commander in his company heard the same information at the same moment. They could coordinate their response immediately. Charlie 1-4, move to cover that approach. Charlie 1-2, I've got angle on their flank. Charlie 1-6, suppressing fire on that lead tank. Everyone else, push forward. The German force was superior in armor and firepower, but they were blind. Their command tanks tried to direct the battle, but hand signals were useless in the fog. Flag signals couldn't be seen. Individual tank commanders had no idea where their comrades were or what the overall tactical situation looked like. The Americans moved like water, flowing around German strongpoints, concentrating fire, calling in artillery support with precise coordinates, coordinating with tank destroyers and infantry. The Battle of Aracourt lasted several days. When it was over, the Germans had lost over 200 tanks. American losses, fewer than 30 Shermans. It wasn't superior armor that won the battle. It wasn't better guns or stronger engines. It was communication. It was the ability for every tank commander to see the battlefield through shared information. It was coordination that the Germans simply could not match. After the battle, American forces captured several German tank crews. During interrogation, one Panzer commander was asked about the engagement. "How did you coordinate your attacks so perfectly?" The American intelligence officer asked, through an interpreter. The German officer looked confused. "Coordinate? We weren't coordinating. We were reacting. Every one of your tanks seemed to know what every other tank was doing. We could not predict your movements. We could not concentrate our fire because your tanks would immediately respond." He paused, then asked his own question. "Do all of your tanks have radio? All of them?" "Yes," the American officer replied. "Every single one." The German officer sat back in his chair, comprehension dawning. Then we never had a chance. The SCR-508 radio that equipped every Sherman tank was the result of years of American innovation in radio technology and mass production techniques. Developed by the Signal Corps, the SCR-508 represented a breakthrough in making military radio both reliable and simple to operate. It used frequency modulation, FM, which was more resistant to interference than the amplitude modulation systems the Germans primarily used. The radio had 10 preset crystal-controlled channels. A tank commander could switch between frequencies with a simple dial, communicating with different units instantly. Company frequency, platoon frequency, battalion frequency, artillery support frequency, all available at the twist of a knob. Colonel Paul Robinette was instrumental in developing American armor doctrine. In 1942, he wrote a manual that emphasized the importance of communication in armored warfare. "A tank without radio is like a blind man in a gunfight. He may have a weapon, but he cannot see his enemy, cannot coordinate with his allies, cannot call for help. Radio is not a luxury. It is as essential as ammunition." This philosophy shaped American tank production. When other nations were debating whether to equip all tanks with radio, every American tank crew received extensive radio training. Not just the radio operator, but every crew member. If the primary radio operator was killed, anyone in the tank could take over communications. Radio discipline was drilled until it became second nature. Clear, concise transmission, proper call signs, confirmation of orders, standard terminology that everyone understood. The Germans had skilled radio operators, but they didn't have enough radios, and their doctrine didn't emphasize communication the way American doctrine did. The radio disparity wasn't just evident in Western Europe. On the Eastern Front, German tankers faced Soviet forces that also had superior radio deployment compared to German units. Lieutenant Gustav Richter commanded a Panther tank in Army Group Center in 1944. His unit faced Soviet T-34 tanks regularly. The T-34 was inferior to the Panther in almost every measurable way: thinner armor, weaker gun, less comfortable crew compartment. But Soviet tank tactics were evolving. partly due to American Lend-Lease radios. Richter described one engagement in his diary, July 1944. We engaged a Soviet tank company near Minsk. We destroyed 3 T-34s quickly, our superior guns making short work of them at range. But then the Soviet tanks scattered in a coordinated pattern, some laying smoke, others flanking. How did they coordinate so quickly? We later learned from prisoners that they had American radio equipment. Not just command tanks, but multiple tanks in each unit. The Soviets may not build tanks as good as ours, but they are learning to use them like the Americans, with coordination and communication we cannot match. By late 1944, American Lend-Lease had supplied the Soviet Union with over 35,000 radio sets specifically designed for armored vehicles. While not every Soviet tank had a radio, their radio density was significantly higher than German units. Combined with American-supplied vehicles, including Sherman tanks with their standard radio equipment, Soviet armored units were becoming increasingly difficult for German forces to counter. The Germans were facing the same problem on two fronts: enemies who could communicate faster and more effectively than they could. German high command wasn't completely blind to the radio problem. By late 1944, there were efforts to increase radio production and equip more tanks with communication equipment. But Germany faced insurmountable obstacles. First, production capacity. German factories were being bombed regularly. Resources were scarce. Radio components required precision manufacturing and rail materials. Copper, crystals, vacuum tubes. Every radio built meant fewer other weapons produced. Second, training. Even if Germany could produce more radios, they didn't have time to properly train crews in radio discipline and coordination tactics. Third, doctrine. German tactical doctrine had been built around the assumption that only command vehicles needed radios. Changing that doctrine would mean rewriting training manuals, reorganizing units, and retraining thousands of tankers. And fourth, most critically, time. Germany no longer had time to solve any of these problems. Major Friedrich Lang was assigned to the Panzerlehr Division in late 1944. His unit received a small number of upgraded radio sets intended to improve communication between tanks. But it was too little, too late. We received perhaps 15 new radio sets for a division that should have had 200, Lang later recalled. And we had no time to train with them properly. The crews didn't understand radio discipline. They clogged the frequencies with unnecessary chatter, or didn't transmit important information because they weren't used to having the capability. Meanwhile, every American tank we faced had radios that their crews had been training with for months or years. They communicated like it was breathing. We fumbled with our new equipment like children with a complicated toy. Lang's unit engaged American forces near Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. Despite having some of Germany's best remaining tanks and most experienced crews, they were consistently outmaneuvered. We would spot American tanks and begin our attack, Lang said. Within seconds, the Americans would respond in perfect coordination. Smoke screens would deploy. Flanking units would move into position. Artillery would be called in with precise coordinates. We were still operating like it was 1940. They were operating like it was the future. One of the most remarkable aspects of the German radio disadvantage was how completely German intelligence failed to recognize it. German intelligence officers knew American tanks had radios. They captured Shermans. They interrogated American tankers. The information was available. But they fundamentally underestimated what that capability meant in practical terms. Hauptmann Otto Berger was an intelligence officer who interrogated American POWs throughout 1944. In dozens of interrogations, American tankers mentioned their radio systems. Berger noted this in his reports, but the reports focused on technical specifications, frequency ranges, transmission power, antenna types. They missed the crucial element, doctrine. Berger later admitted his failure in a post-war interview. We saw the radios as equipment. We compared specifications. We noted that American radios had good range and clear transmission. But we failed to understand that having radio in every tank fundamentally changed how American units fought. We thought of tanks as individual weapons platforms. The Americans thought of tank companies as single coordinated entities connected by invisible communications networks. We were counting guns and measuring armor thickness, while they were creating a networked fighting force. We were fighting yesterday's war. They were fighting tomorrow's. German technical intelligence actually produced a detailed report on the SCR-508 radio in early 1944. The report was thorough, accurate, and completely misunderstood the implications. The conclusion of the report stated, American radio technology is adequate but not exceptional. Their decision to equip all tanks with radio reflects American industrial excess rather than tactical necessity. Our selective approach to radio deployment is more efficient and economical. This conclusion would prove to be one of the most costly intelligence failures of the war. To truly understand the advantage American radio provided, we need to hear from the men who used it in combat. Sergeant Michael Torres was a Sherman tank commander with the 3rd Armored Division. He fought from Normandy to Germany, from June 1944 to May 1945. The radio wasn't just equipment, Torres explained in a 1985 interview. It was our lifeline. Every morning, we'd test communications before moving out. Every man in my crew knew how to operate it. We'd sleep with the radio on low volume so we could hear if command needed us at night. In combat, the radio meant we were never alone. Even if we couldn't see other tanks, we could hear them. We knew where they were, what they were doing, what they were seeing. It was like having eyes all over the battlefield. Torres described one engagement near Stolberg, Germany in September 1944. We were advancing through a town when my gunner spotted a Panther hull down behind a building. Before I could give orders, I was already calling it in on the radio. Baker 2-3, enemy armor, Panther, northwest corner of the church, my 12 o'clock. Immediately, 3 other tanks confirmed they heard me. One moved to flank. One prepared to lay smoke if I needed to pull back. One called battalion to request tank destroyer support. All of that happened in maybe 10 seconds. We didn't need to stop and send a runner. We didn't need to wait for flag signals. We just communicated. And because we could communicate instantly, we could react instantly. That Panther could probably have killed my tank in a straight fight. Better gun, better armor. But it was alone, and I had 14 other tanks that knew exactly where it was and what we needed to do. We hit it from 3 angles simultaneously. It never had a chance. The psychological impact of constant communication was significant. American tank crews felt connected, supported, aware of the bigger picture. German crews increasingly felt isolated and blind. Lieutenant Hayes, the former radio technician turned tank commander, described it this way. Imagine fighting in a dark room. That was the Germans. They could only see what was directly in front of them. Now, imagine someone turns on the lights, and suddenly you can see the whole room. That was us with radio. We could see through walls because our buddies on the other side were telling us what they saw. The Germans were brave, skilled, well-trained, but they were fighting blind while we had perfect vision. Courage doesn't matter much when you can't see the enemy coming. The true power of American radio capability wasn't just tank-to-tank communication. It was the ability to coordinate combined arms operations seamlessly. Sherman tanks didn't just talk to each other. They could talk to infantry units, artillery batteries, tank destroyers, air support, reconnaissance units, command headquarters, supply columns, all on different frequencies, all accessible with a simple turn of a dial. Captain James Benson commanded a tank company in the 4th Armored Division. He described a typical engagement. We'd spot enemy positions and immediately call for artillery support while maneuvering our tanks. The artillery forward observer was on our frequency, so he could hear our reports in real time and adjust fire without delay. If we needed air support, I could switch to the air liaison frequency and talk directly to the fighter bombers overhead. Not through 3 layers of command, not through written requests, directly. If we needed infantry support to clear buildings, I called the infantry commander, who was usually within a mile of us. Everything was connected. Everything was coordinated. We fought as a single integrated force, not as separate units that happened to be in the same area. Narrator: the Germans simply couldn't match this level of coordination. Their radio limitations meant delays at every stage. A tank commander might spot enemy positions, but reporting them required either breaking radio silence to transmit to the command tank, using visual signals that might not be seen, sending a runner, which took precious minutes. Then the command tank had to relay information up the chain to battalion, who would contact artillery or air support through different communication networks. By the time German artillery or air support arrived, the tactical situation had often changed completely. American units could call in supporting fire in seconds and have it arrive in minutes. German units needed minutes to call for support and might wait hours for it to arrive. By early 1945, the radio disparity had become even more pronounced. Germany's communication infrastructure was collapsing. Allied bombing had destroyed telephone networks. Radio production had nearly ceased. Trained radio operators were dead or captured. Meanwhile, American radio capability had only improved. New models were being introduced. Crews had months or years of experience working together. Radio discipline was second nature. Oberleutnant Hans Müller commanded one of the last operational Panthers in Army Group B in April 1945. He described the final weeks. We were ghosts. We couldn't coordinate with other units because we rarely had working radios, and even when we did, there were no other units to coordinate with. Command had no idea where we were or what we were doing. The Americans always knew where we were. Their reconnaissance planes would spot us and report our position. Within minutes, every American unit in the area knew exactly where we were and what we were doing. Artillery would find us. Fighter bombers would find us. Tanks would maneuver to cut off our retreat routes. We weren't fighting battles anymore. We were just trying to survive long enough to surrender to Americans instead of Soviets. The last major tank battle of the European War occurred near the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945. American forces encountered a desperate German counterattack by the remnants of several panzer divisions. The German tanks were, in many cases, superior vehicles, Panthers, King Tigers, even a few of the massive Jagdtigers. But they operated in isolation, without communication, without coordination, without hope. American Shermans, supported by perfect communication, combined arms coordination, and overwhelming resources, destroyed the German force in less than a day. Captain Torres, who participated in that battle, said, "It wasn't even fair anymore. They were brave men fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. We knew where they were before they knew where we were. We could coordinate responses before they could coordinate attacks. They were fighting a 1940 war in 1945, and it showed. After the war, military analysts from around the world studied the reasons for American success in armored warfare. They expected to find answers in armor thickness, gun caliber, engine power. What they found instead was communication. A post-war U.S. Army study concluded, the single most significant advantage American armored units possessed was not superior equipment quality, but superior communication capability. Radio-equipped tanks operating under doctrine that emphasized coordination consistently defeated technically superior opponents who lacked equivalent communication capabilities. German officers who survived the war came to similar conclusions. In dozens of post-war interviews, former Panzer commanders cited American radio superiority as a critical factor in German defeat. Oberst Heinrich von Schell, who commanded panzer units on both the Eastern and Western fronts, was blunt in his assessment. We built better tanks, we trained better crews, we developed better tactics, and we lost anyway because we couldn't talk to each other. The Americans turned warfare into a conversation, and we were still passing notes. If I could change one thing about German tank development, it wouldn't be thicker armor or bigger guns. It would be a radio in every tank from 1939 onward. That single change might have altered the course of the war. The lessons learned from American radio superiority shaped post-war armored doctrine worldwide. Today, it's inconceivable that any military would field tanks without comprehensive communication equipment. Advanced radios, data links, GPS, satellite communications, modern armored vehicles are mobile communication hubs. But in World War II, this concept was revolutionary, and America's decision to embrace it gave their tank crews an advantage that German troops never fully understood until it was too late. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, the radio technician turned tank commander, served through the entire European campaign. He survived the war, returned to Philadelphia, and worked in the communications industry for 40 years. In a 1990 interview, shortly before his death, he was asked what he thought was the most important weapon in World War II. He thought for a moment, then smiled. "The SCR 508 radio," he said. "Most people have never heard of it." It never gets mentioned in documentaries about great weapons. It's not in museums with dramatic lighting and reverential plaques. But that radio saved my life dozens of times. It saved the lives of every man in my crew. It let us fight smart instead of just fighting hard. It turned our average tanks and average soldiers into a force that defeated what was supposed to be the world's best army. The Germans had better tanks. We had better communication. In the end, being able to talk to each other mattered more than having thicker arm. War is about information as much as ammunition. The Germans never understood that. We did, and that made all the difference. German troops never knew that American Sherman tanks had the world's most advanced radios. By the time they realized the truth, they had already lost hundreds of tanks, thousands of men, and ultimately the war. The invisible advantage had decided the visible outcome.